By now, you've read enough school stories to see what I meant when, early on, I described scenes of punishment as the narrative climax of the stories. It should be even clearer to you in Stalky that this is so. Let's unpack some of the ideas floating around, spoken and unspoken, about beatings and other punishments in school stories. First, beatings were very, very common in boys' public schools in England. When the rest of British schools moved away from corporal punishment on grounds that it was both inhumane and ineffective, public schools maintained their long-established punishment regimes, partly on grounds of tradition. Remember, it would be commonplace for a boy to attend the same school his father and even grandfather had attended, and old boys, the most common name for alumni, would of course look on all the things they experienced at school through a nostalgic lens. I think of this as akin to the way medical education has been slow to change, despite studies that show that, for instance, having young doctors as part of their training work 48-hour shifts is dangerous for patients and unhelpful for young doctors. But all their teachers and everyone who has been through the system can say, "I survived that and it didn't do me any harm." In fact, they may argue it did them good. In any case, British state schools were banned from using corporal punishment in the 1980s, but public schools, which received no funding from the state, maintained the practice until 1998. So when school stories depict scenes of epic beatings, they were depicting something that was routine in actually existing schools. There were elaborate hierarchies about corporal punishment, probably too arcane for us to figure out, but basically, if you were a junior, someone in the fourth form or lower, that applies to our magnet boys, your form master could thrash you at his discretion, and for egregious offenses you would be sent to the headmaster for a flogging. Generally, form masters caned boys, in many schools beating them on the hands with a rattan cane. In others, boys were beaten on the buttocks with a cane. Flogging always referred to being beaten on the buttocks, and usually the instrument used was called a birch or birch rod, a gathered bundle of twigs that would cut the skin, often embedding pieces of the switches in the boy. Beatings were classified as public or private. A beating in the classroom was a fairly minor affair, a beating in the headmaster's study more of a big deal, and a beating in public before the assembled student body the most extreme punishment short of expulsion. Senior boys were generally not beaten, except in very extreme circumstances. A boy who was caught going out of school grounds to drink or smoke might be beaten rather than expelled for a first offense. And of course, some senior boys had rights to beat younger ones, prefects in every school, and sometimes also the captain of games or the school captain. It would be nice to think that all the people authorized to beat the boys did so only out of the best possible motives, hoping to set the boys straight, for example. But as I'm sure you can imagine, bullies were overjoyed to become prefects because the school would give them a sanctioned weapon they could use against the younger boys. And some of the masters, too, historically had been attracted to teaching not for the joy of seeing knowledge and wisdom dawning in their young charges, but because they got sadistic sexual pleasure from savagely beating children. Remember, all the teachers at these schools would have been products of similar schools, so all of them would have experienced the moral harm of having been sadistically beaten in their youth. What's more, in some schools, such as Eton, it was usual for boys to have to undress for beatings. So you can see why beatings would be saturated with erotic energy. School story writers use this energy for narrative purposes when they place a beating at the climax of the narrative arc. Let's think about how this works in The Magnet for a minute. You might have a beating scene that is comical, such as when Bunter is beaten, or you might have a scene like the one where Mr. Steele beats Smithy, which is deadly serious. But whether the beating is comical or serious, it is described in loving detail. I hope you can see how odd this is. There are other common tropes in school stories, for example, scenes of eating, and sometimes these are described in infinite detail as well. But there is hardly a scene of corporal punishment that escapes this treatment. So the school story uses beatings in a very particular way. If we think about the PowerPoint you watched about Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, we learned that schools were an institution whose purpose was to help with a societal changeover from a punishment-oriented system to a disciplinary one. Punishment, remember, is imposed on a person from outside by some authority. Discipline is imposed from the inside. So when Bunter does something wrong and his form master canes him for it, that's punishment. But when Wharton says, "We're not going to do that, it's not right," that's discipline. Punishment makes you feel the authority's displeasure. To the extent that good behavior flows from it, that's because you fear the authority. But discipline doesn't have to involve the authority at all. It can be completely internal, and it is all about the rewards you get when you internalize and then follow the rules. Wharton is typically very good about this, and he is rewarded by being the head boy of his form, and by having as friends the best, most honorable boys in the class, and through the narratives regarding him as a fine example of the kind of gentleman every reader should aspire to be. Foucault argues that schools are the primary apparatus used by culture to shift from a punishment basis to a discipline basis. How can we reconcile that idea with the forms of punishment we've seen in school stories we've read so far? After all, Stalky is a late Victorian school story, and the boys are beaten frequently, sometimes despite the fact that they've organized things so that they aren't technically guilty of anything, as in the Impressionists. But even in Stalky, where the boys are pretty bad, all things considered, we can see that there is a discipline system in place. The boys fully understand how to operate within the system. They know what the system truly values, stalkiness, and they are scrupulously honest despite the fact that they are extremely manipulative. So why is there so much punishment if the purpose of the school is to move boys to the discipline mode? I would suggest that this is another sign that corporal punishment in the school story has narrative purposes beyond its purpose in the running of an actual school. Discipline at the Call is taught through stories like Regulus, and also through events like the return of Crandall to tell the story of Fatsow. Scenes of punishment are not really part of that regime. Instead, they provide the erotic energy I've talked about already, and they also serve to demonstrate that the stalkiest member of the Call is, in fact, the head. We can see this especially clearly in a story like The Impressionists, when the head remarks as he beats Maturk that there's a certain flagrant injustice about this that ought to appeal to your temperament. The narrator had earlier told us that the head had seen all that was hidden from the housemaster. The head has a reputation as a downy bird, meaning he understands everything about the schoolboys and can't be fooled. But after this injustice, the boys acknowledge that they are not wrathy with the head, and Maturk calls him a dear man. The basis of the boys' admiration for the head is evidently both that the head can't be tricked and that he is a master with the cane. Maturk notes that the Prussian Bates has an infernal straight eye, and the narrator assures readers that there was not a penny to choose between any of them for thoroughness, efficiency, and a certain clarity of outline that stamps the work of the artist. We know that the beating was especially severe because the boys admit they were within an inch of blubbing, and Stalky tells Mr. Prout that they have been caned and are washing off the blood. There is pride in withstanding severe beatings. Remember, in The Magnet, Smithy is stoic, while Bunter hails even the idea of the cane with loud yaroos. But there is also something class-based about this. The head assures Stalky, Beetle, and Maturk that what he is doing to them would open him up to a charge of assault among the lower social orders. Remember that the purpose of the British public school is to prepare boys to serve as rulers in imperial possessions. Next week, you'll read a story set after graduation, when Stalky is working as a military officer. His ability to withstand suffering, indeed, to take the suffering as a source of class pride, and his flexibility with regard to official rules are key to an impressive military victory. So these over-the-top physical punishments, then, have one more function, as a stand-in for the challenges boys will face after school, challenges they are to face unemotionally and without giving way to vulnerability. This is a class-based requirement, but also a gender-based one. It's one of those moments when we realize that the school story's argument for what a gentleman does also argues for what proper masculinity is. This week in the forum, you'll you'll have the opportunity to think about both sanctioned and unsanctioned violence, physical punishments doled out to boys by authorized persons, and violence that the boys visit on one another and on their masters in the dog-eat-dog world of the school. How is discipline involved in this violence, and how does it distinguish itself from it?